Hello. Let's see if the librarian can... There we go. Hi, everybody. Messed up the camera today. Had a meeting and I got in here a little bit late. Okay. Welcome to story time. Well, the story we have for today is a story that comes from Italy. It's a story... This is a story that might sound a little bit familiar to some people, and then a little bit different. So hopefully this will be a story that you'll like. This is the story of Petrosinella. Story from Italy, Petrosinella. Once, long ago, there was a lady, and she was pregnant. She was going to have a baby. And she lived next door to an ogress. And the ogress liked to practice magic some, and she also had a really big, beautiful garden. Well, one day, the lady who was pregnant was looking out of the window of her house, of her bedroom, and she could see down into the ogress's garden. And there was some parsley in that garden. And suddenly, the mama was just feeling like she really wanted some parsley. And she told herself she couldn't have any because that was the ogress's parsley. And an ogress is a girl ogre, and they're not very nice. And so she couldn't just go ask for some because the ogress would definitely not give it to her. And she knew the ogress wouldn't sell her any because the ogress used what was in her garden for all of her magic and her potions and things. But she really wanted some of that parsley, and a couple of days went by and she just really wanted some of that parsley, and the only way she could think of to get it was to just go take some, to steal some. And so when the ogress went out in the morning, the lady went downstairs and she snuck through one of the gates into the garden, and she stole some of the parsley and she took it home and she put it in her salad and she ate it, and it was delicious. Oh, it tasted so wonderful. The next morning, she woke up and she wanted more. And she fought that want for a couple of days, and then finally she decided to go steal some more. And so when the ogress left, she went down and she got more parsley. And this kept happening until the lady was going down almost every day and taking more parsley. And pretty soon the ogress started to think that maybe it wasn't the birds stealing her parsley. And so the next morning, when she went out like she normally did, she came back quickly and she found that lady. She caught her standing in the garden with a handful of parsley. She said, "Thief! You thief! I'll kill you for this." And the lady said, "Oh no, please, 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 I'll pay you for it. I'll gladly pay you for it, please. It's just a little thing. It's just a little parsley. Please don't punish me. I'll give you anything. I'll give you anything you want, please." "Anything? Oh, yes, anything. Do you promise?" "Yes, I promise." "I want your child, boy or girl." "I want your child." Oh, and the lady was so sad, but she had promised. She couldn't say no. Well, when the baby was born a few months later, it was a beautiful baby girl, and she had a little birthmark on her chest that looked like a delicate little sprig of parsley. And so the lady named her daughter Petrosinella, which in Italian meant parsley. Well, a couple of years went by, and every day the mother was terrified that the ogress was going to come and take her baby away. But then a couple more years went by, and she started to think maybe the ogress had forgotten that she had said she was going to take the child. 7 years passed, and one day Petrosinella was on her way to school, And she walked past the door in the wall that was always locked. It was the one that went into the garden, for the ogress's garden. And when she passed that door today, it opened. And the ogress stepped out and she said, 7 years ago, your mother promised me something, and today I'm going to take it. And she took Petrosinella by the arm and she dragged her away and she took her out into the forest. And by her magic, she made a very tall tower grow that was taller than all of the trees. And she went up a winding staircase inside the tower, and she put Petrosinella down in the tower, and she sealed up the door so they couldn't get out. And then she took, Petrosinella had beautiful long golden hair that the ogress rather liked, and she made that hair grow longer and longer and longer until it was as long as the tower. And so when the ogress wanted to go out in the morning, she would have Petrosinella drop her hair out the tower, and she would climb down it like a ladder. And when she would come home at night, she would call out, and Petrosinella would drop her hair down again, and the ogress would climb up. Well, that was how life passed for quite a while for Petrosinella. She lived in that tower, and that was the only thing she saw. Come to think of it, it must have been a little bit like right now for all of us. She couldn't go outside. She couldn't go see anybody. She didn't get to see her mother anymore. She didn't get to see any of her friends. She just had to stay in the tower. And so to keep herself cheerful, she cleaned up the tower and she made little things, and then she would go and she would stand in the sunshine on the balcony of the tower and she would sing. And that was how she occupied her time. Well, many years passed, and now Petrosinella was a teenager and starting to get about 17 or 18, and she was a little sad because she really would like to see other people from time to time, but all she ever saw was the ogress, and sometimes one of the ogress's friends would come to visit. They were all nosy old witches or other ogresses or something like that, and they really weren't anyone that Petrosinella could really talk to. But one day, as Petrosinella was standing on the balcony, enjoying the sunshine and singing a beautiful song, a prince happened to be riding through the forest. And that prince heard the most beautiful singing he had ever heard. Well, wherever is that coming from? I thought this forest was nothing but animals. And so he followed the sound of that singing until he found a very tall tower. Where did this come from? I don't remember this tower being here before. And so he got down from his horse and he walked around the tower looking for the door. But he couldn't find one because the ogress had sealed it up. And so he stood at the bottom of the tower and he looked up, way up to the top of the tower, and he saw well, it looked like it was a pretty girl up there, but she was so far away, it was rather hard to tell. But she had such a beautiful voice, he thought she must be beautiful too. And he looked up and Excuse me, you have a very beautiful voice. Won't you come down? I'd like to talk to you. And she leaned over and she looked down. Well, I can't come down. There's no way down. But you can come up. And she took her hair and she threw it out the window. And the prince climbed up her hair. And he came into the tower. And he came in and he looked at her. And he thought, she wasn't the most beautiful woman he'd ever seen, but she was one of the sweetest looking women that he'd ever seen. And she seemed so gentle. And the thing was, he did need to get married sometime soon. And he thought she might be a good girl, but he didn't really know her very well. And she said, well, hello? She hadn't seen another person since she was 7, so she was kind of surprised. But he was kind of good looking, and she thought he looked kind of nice, and maybe he could help her get out of the tower. But suddenly she thought about it and realized the ogress might come back any time. Oh, I shouldn't have had you come up here. Oh, there's a terrible ogress who lives with me, and she does magic, and you really should go now. You really should go. If she comes back and finds you here, I don't even know what she'll do to us. And the prince said, "It's okay, I'll go, but could I come back and talk to you later?" And she said, "Oh, but the ogress, I don't want her to hurt you or me, and I don't know what she'll do." "I have an idea," he said. "Do you have any poppy juice?" And she said, "Well, yes, I have some. We use it for, there's a toothache or something." And he said, "Put some in her soup tonight, and then she'll sleep really well, and I'll come back after dark, and you can let me up and we can talk." "All right, that should work." And so he climbed back down. And that night, when Petrosinella served the soup, she put some poppy juice in the ogress's soup. And the ogress ate all the soup up, and then she got very tired, because that's what poppy juice does to you. It makes you very tired. She got very tired, and she went and she laid down, and she slept really hard all night long. And after she was asleep and snoring, Petrosinella went over and she dropped her hair out the window, and the prince climbed up and he came inside, and they talked all night long. And they found out they had a lot of things in common, and they really liked each other. And the prince really didn't want to leave at the end of the night, but he had to because the ogress was going to wake up soon. And so he left. And the next night, Petrosinella put more poppy juice in the ogress's soup, and the prince climbed back up her hair, and they talked all night long. And this went on for quite a while, and the prince and Petrosinella just kept falling more and more and more in love with each other. Well, unfortunately, one night, as the prince was getting ready to leave before the sun came up, they had a problem. When he climbed down Petrosinella's hair, he thought he was alone in the forest, but he wasn't. One of the ogress's friends was nearby. She was a nosy old witch, and she was out hunting for mushrooms at night, and she saw the prince climb down out of the tower. And she knew there wasn't supposed to be a man anywhere near that tower. And so the next day she came over to see her friend the ogress. And she climbed up Petrosinella's hair, and she went in to talk to the ogress, and she said, "My friend, you have a problem. You're not going to believe what I saw last night." And she told the ogress all about what she had seen. And the ogress said, "That's not a problem. But he might steal her away." "Oh, no. No, he won't. You see, the child cannot leave me. I have put a spell on her. And I have put the anchor of the spell in 3 pine cones, and I've hidden them. And unless she has those pine cones in her pocket, she cannot leave the tower, even if she tries." "Oh, well, that is clever," said her friend. "Now, but are you sure you've hidden the pine cones well enough?" "Oh, of course I have. They're somewhere the child would never look. They're up in the rafters. She'll never find them. She'll never even see them. It's not a problem." And the ogress and the nosy old witch laughed together because they thought that was a perfect plan. What they didn't know is that Petrosinella had been listening just behind the curtain over the door. And she smiled quietly to herself because now she knew why she had never been able to leave the tower, even though her prince had asked her to. Well, that night, she put a little poppy juice in the ogress's soup, and the ogress drank it all up. And she went to bed, thinking that she would be safe. Petrosinella would never leave. And when the prince climbed up Petrosinella's hair that night, she told him about the 3 pine cones, and they went and they started looking, and they found the pine cones. And quickly they took the pine cones, and Petrosinella put them in her apron pocket, and the prince brought out a rope that he had brought with him, and they tied it onto a hook in the room, and they lowered themselves down, and they started running through the forest to try to get back to the prince's castle before the ogress caught them. Unfortunately, the nosy old witch was out hunting mushrooms again. And she saw them climb down out of that tower and start to run away. And she started shrieking and yelling and shrieking and yelling for her friend the ogress to come quick. Petrosinella's getting away. Well, she yelled and shrieked so loudly that she woke up the ogress. And the ogress came thundering down out of that tower, and she started to chase Petrosinella and the prince. And she started to catch up because she was using her magic to run fast. Well, they started to hear her get closer and closer, and suddenly Petrosinella thought of those pine cones in her pocket, and she thought, maybe they might help me somehow. And so she took one out of her pocket, and she threw it on the ground behind her, and she and the prince kept running. Well, as soon as that pine cone hit the ground, it sprang up into a big dog, and it was sitting there, in the pathway, growling at the witch. Well, the witch barely lost a step. She reached inside her coat, she pulled out a loaf of bread, and she threw it at that dog. And the dog pounced on the loaf of bread and started eating the loaf of bread and was paying more attention to that. So the witch ran on past him. Well, pretty soon she started to catch up to Petrosinella and the prince again. And Petrosinella reached into her pocket, and she brought out the second pine cone, and she threw it on the ground behind her, and she and the prince kept on running as fast as they could go. Well, as soon as that pine cone hit the ground, it became a great big lion. And that lion was prowling in the middle of the path, and growling, and roaring. And the ogress came around the corner, and he roared at her, and she very quickly magicked up a donkey skin, and she pulled it over her head, and that poor lion was so confused, because it was a person, and now it was a donkey, and what was he supposed to do with it? Was he supposed to roar at it, or was he supposed to jump on it, or what was he supposed to do with it? He got so confused, he decided to go find a breakfast somewhere else that wasn't so wishy-washy and changeable. So he left. And the ogress went running after Petrosinella and the prince again. Well, Petrosinella heard the ogress starting to catch up again, and she pulled out that last pine cone and she said, please, please, please let this one work and keep her away. And she threw that pine cone down behind her onto the ground, and she and the prince kept on running. And as soon as that pine cone hit the ground, it became a great big wolf. And the ogress came around the corner, and that wolf, he didn't wait to growl at her. He didn't wait to roar at her. He didn't prowl at all. He just pounced on her and gobbled her up. And the ogress was dead. And Petrosinella and the prince, they didn't know that. They were still running. They were still running. And they kept listening, and the ogress wasn't coming. And eventually, they slowed down a little bit, because now they were out of breath. But eventually, they made it back to the prince's kingdom, and they started making plans to get married. There was just one thing they needed. Do you know what that one thing might be? It was Petrosinella's mother. They sent her a note, and she came to the palace, and she was so happy to see her daughter again because she had missed her so much. And she came to live with them in the palace. And then very next day, she got to see her beautiful daughter become a princess. And they put all of the terrible things behind them and decided to live happily from there on out. And that is the story of Petrosinella from Italy. I hope you enjoyed it. And let's see, Friday at 3 o'clock here on the Milledgeville Public Library, Illinois Facebook page, I think we'll tell you a story from the Native American tradition in North America, and it is called The Ants That Pushed on the Sky. Comes from the Pueblo people in the Southwest in the United States. So we'll be telling The Ants That Pushed on the Sky at 3 p.m. Central Daylight Time on the Milledgeville Public Library Facebook page. We'll see you all then. Thanks for watching. Bye.